7:01 Eastern Time. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch of From Vimy to Juno, Canadians Through Two World Wars, a new digital exhibition and educational resource. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Alex Fitzgerald Black, and I was recently appointed Executive Director at the Juno Beach Centre Association, the Ontario-based charity that owns and operates the Juno Beach Centre, Canada's Second World War Museum and Cultural Centre on the D-Day landing beaches in Normandy, France. One of the components of From Vimy to Juno that we are excited to bring to Canadians is Indigenous Service. In that same spirit, we are grateful for our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit veterans. The Juno Beach Centre Association office is located in Burlington, Ontario, and Burlington, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Haudenosaunee and the Métis, our lands spanning from Lake Ontario to the Niagara Escarpment are steeped in Indigenous history. The territory is mutually covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and other allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We would like to acknowledge that the land on which our office resides is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. Now, before we really get going today, a few tips for using Zoom. Your cameras are automatically turned off unless you're a panelist, and your microphones are muted. You won't be able to adjust these settings as an attendee. You can, however, access the chat or Q&A functions at the bottom of your screen. Please send on any questions you have through the Q&A function throughout the webinar. Our special projects coordinator, Louisa Simmons, will be managing the back end of this presentation. She will help us manage the questions that you may submit during the presentation so that we may address them in the Q&A. Firstly, before we get really started this evening and I introduce the various panelists you'll see in front of you there, I'd like to make a few brief remarks to thank all of those involved with the project. But even before I do that, I wanted to start with a short story. So just over a year ago, in the fall of 2020, I took a phone call from a teacher who had used our educational resources in the past. I solved a small issue for her, and then I took a moment to ask her what teaching was like in the midst of the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. She indicated that the biggest challenge with online learning was in getting all of her students equal access to the same resources. In a classroom, the teacher and students have access to common textbooks, to films, or photocopies from the library. But in the virtual environment, this was no longer the case. What she really needed at the time was effectively a virtual textbook that all of the students could either access as a group or on their own time. I wish I'd been able to provide her with access to our From Vimy to Juno exhibition at that time. And I hope that our new website and educational resources find their way into the digital teaching world beginning in 2022 for the 105th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April. And I hope they're well received. And if you're an educator, I hope you'll share them with your colleagues and friends. From Vimy to Juno, Canadians Through Two World Wars has undergone a lengthy journey to get to this point. The origins of the web exhibit go back to early 2016, and as a result, so many people have contributed to the effort. I have to begin by thanking my predecessors in this post, Jenna Zuslag-Meisner, who initiated the project to build the digital exhibition, and Dr. Mike Bechtold, who contributed some of the excellent maps found in the Second World War section. Special thanks also go to Jen Terry, who's with us today, who worked on this project longer than anyone before handing the reins over to me in early 2020. Her passion for history education really shows through in the final result. Others I would like to thank include Dr. Serge Derflinger, the historian who wrote several of the articles in the exhibit, Lindsay Hutchison, who you'll hear from shortly, wrote the lesson plans connected to the website, and Chantal Fontaine provided the French translations and years later also undertook a significant comparative edit for us. Thank you as well to Catherine Morrow, Barry McKenzie, Shake Ottman, Louisa Orford, Anna Zuslag, and Scott Entwistle, who provided research and text behind stories in the exhibition. Thank you as well to the various archives, museums, and history organizations who provided content support for the exhibition, including Wartime Canada, Library and Archives Canada, the Canadian War Museum, the Memory Project, now Historica Canada, and the Vimy Foundation. Thank you also to Grace Bedwell, Pam Calvert, Neil Orford, and Mariette Villancourt, who's here with us today, for your varying contributions and counsel over the years. Special thanks as well go to Digital Museums Canada for funding our project In particular, I'd like to thank Natalie Roy, who made sure that we kept things on track once I took over the file. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention our friends at Planck who partnered with us on this digital initiative. Thanks to Warren Willonsky, who's here with us today, for his firm's support in applying for the grant in the first place. And special thanks as well to Anna Cabell, our project manager at Planck, who did an outstanding job helping us to get this project to the finish line. I also apologize if there's anyone who I've not mentioned who made a contribution. Thank you for your help. Finally, I'd like to thank our donors for supporting the Juno Beach Center and our educational initiatives. With that, we're going to open things up with a video today, and I'm going to get Louisa to share that with you. This is a video you'll probably recall from a couple years ago, and it'll transition into the website in a very nice way for us in a moment. So go ahead, Louisa.
They were just kids from New Brunswick. Never even left the North Shore before. Dad trained them the best he could. But how could they possibly be prepared? This was the biggest operation the world had ever seen. He'd already served in the First World War, earned the right to stay home, raise his children. But how could he send those boys into battle and not be by their side? Many were killed that day. One was my father.
Major Archie McNaughton was 47 when he died on D-Day, the invasion that marked the beginning of the end of the Second World War.
So you may have seen that video a couple years ago. It was released for the 75th anniversary of D-Day and the Battle of Normandy. And John Archibald McNaughton's story is central to this website. And also that video, one of the historical advisors on the video was Jen Terry, who was on our team at the time, who helped to build this website, and who one of her passions, I think, is sharing Major McNaughton's story. And so I'm probably going to let her do most of that here. And what I thought I'd do is that transitioned us well to a point where I can take about 5 minutes or so and to try to do a website overview with everybody to showcase the website, what's there, how you can navigate it. So Louise, I'll just get you to pull up the website. So we're starting from Archie's story here, the Archie's narrative. And Archie's story is one of 25 events or narratives. There are 18 events and 7 narratives on the website. And these are the 2 types of major content on the website. Now, narratives can either be single person stories or a thematic collection of these stories. Each major piece of content has a main text article that runs the length of the page. Archie's is in the form of a biography. And interspersed between sections of the text are various digital documents. You can see images, archival documents like Archie's attestation papers for the First World War, and the many personal letters, some of the many personal letters that he wrote home. Often when we have many images on a similar theme, they're collected into a gallery like the one you can see there. And clicking into each of these items gives one a better view of the contents, whether it's in a gallery or not. For instance, let's go down here and explore the news clipping when Andrew McNaughton, General McNaughton, inspected Canadian troops in the UK. And one of the men he was inspecting at the time, this is in 1941, was Archie McNaughton. If you scroll down a little bit there, Louisa, to the middle images, on the left-hand side, you can see someone there holding a map board. And that is Major McNaughton, who is meeting with General McNaughton at the time as his company is being inspected. You can also see, if you go just go down a little bit further there, Louisa, that each image is accompanied by a caption at the top, which you probably saw on the way down, and then the source information below it. So if we go back to the home page, Louisa, and we get there by clicking on this stylized maple leaf in the top left, here we should note that within the narratives or events, this is the best way to get back to the home page, is clicking on that maple leaf. The website overall is a fairly straightforward setup. There are 5 other main pages beyond the home page, which is this page you see in front of you. If you can show the content squares, Louisa, from the home page, we can get to any event or narrative just by clicking on one of those image boxes. And that'll take you directly to the event or narrative that you're interested in. We were just in the John Archibald MacNaughton section, which Louise is indicating to you there. Now at the bar on the top of the screen, and this is present on any major page of the website, you sometimes have to just move your mouse to the top of the screen for it to appear. You have a number of features. So firstly, you have the stylized maple leaf that always gets you back to the home page. You have the language toggle to go between English and French. Everything is available on this website in both languages. You have a drop-down menu, which is the 3 bars, that essentially gives you an overlay of the home page, the square images here. And that's a really good, useful tool for quickly moving between one narrative or one event and another. Finally, there are links to the Juno Beach Center website and to the Digital Museums of Canada website as well, our major funder for this exhibition. Now, on the bar at the bottom of the screen, you have links to a feedback form page, which you can use, to send us information about how you've found a typo somewhere in the lesson plans or, in one of the events. You can also, give us feedback in any way there. There's the lesson plans page, which is perhaps the most in-depth page other than the home page and the article pages. And in here, there are 5 different lessons. We'll go over a little bit of the contents of them in a little while, but basically they're available in 2 formats. One is a downloadable PDF file that you can get, and the other is in the HTML version so that you can just view the lesson plan on the website itself. The credits page includes a list similar to the one I went through earlier, so don't need to really share that with you. You kind of, I think, get what that's all about. And then the further reading page offers links to external resources for teaching or learning about the First and Second World Wars in the first half of the 20th century in Canada. Finally, there is the sitemap, which Louise will click on here. And this is a useful tool for if you just want, instead of the visual method, you can just use the text in the link to get yourself quickly from one event or narrative or what have you to another simply by going through there. And I'll get you to click on the Sicily and Italian campaign one. So we can go into the Italian campaign this way. And here I wanted to share with you the details included on some of our digital document modules. So we're going to go into Bill Telesky, his audio file. And so this is an interview. It's about 3.5 minutes long, or at least from where he talks about his experience during the Battle of Ortona in the Italian campaign. You can see that here that in addition to playing the file, you can access the transcript of the interview. And so this is great for accessibility purposes or just for, making sure that you can follow along and see what he's saying here. Makes it very useful for historical projects of a whole bunch of stripes. Also, a lot of our, a number of our contents, including this one, our veteran interviews, for instance, they were only done in English, of course. And so it is a bilingual site. And so what the transcript allows us to do is we have a French translation of that transcript there, although the original audio footage is, of course, in English, because, you can't go back and re-record the veteran speaking in a language he possibly did not ever speak. So to exit a media module like this one, there's 2 ways to do that. You can either click the X button to the top right of the screen, or you can click the return to, whatever article that you're in button there, and that gets you back to, where you started. Now, navigating between events or narratives, there are a few ways to do this. You can either treat the website as a digital book of sorts, so you can just scroll all the way to the bottom of each page and basically click to get to the next event or narrative in chronological order. So, D-Day following the Italian campaign there. Or you can use the bar at the bottom. You can see that there's a timeline bar at the bottom of the screen here, and it's there, regardless of where you are on the page. And you can float back and forth that way to determine where you want to go. And then the fastest way to get from one place to another, if you know where you want to go, is to use that drop-down menu at the top, as we showed you before. You click on that, you find whichever article that you want to look into, you click on that, and you're there. So some general notes about the content that's available here to be explored. There are a total of more than 300 digital documents on the website. That's anything from, personal letters to archival photos. There's almost 200 archival photos on here, audio and video clips and interviews, posters, maps and diagrams, various, war art and things like that. There are, 21 archival documents, things like, the War Measures Act of both world wars, I believe, is on there, and about 18 different press clippings from various events throughout the First and Second World War. So it's a really rich site in different content types. And really, the really great thing, if we go back to that Archie McNaughton piece, is, you've got that amazing video that Historical Canada has created, and they even have, a nice biography on their website, but they don't have anything like this where you can go through and actually look at some of the original, sources that actually would have built that biography of him in the first place and helped to build that video. So that's kind of the neat part of this, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. All told, there are 80,000 or more English words on the website, and as French is, it's a little longer, 92,000 French words on the website. So it's almost like a full-size book when you count everything. Now, some of that is alt text for some of the accessibility parts, but nevertheless, it's quite a website. So if you have any questions about navigating the site or the content that's in there, please submit your questions so we can address it at the end in the Q&A, and that's going to follow the discussion with the panel that we've assembled for today's launch, and I'm going to move into that now and introduce the panel. So I'm so very grateful that we've been able to assemble this panel of educators, historians, curators, and web developers who have worked hard over the years to bring this content to you. You already know who I am. We've got, I'm going to do it in a bit of a different order than it's on the screen here. We have Marie-Ève Viencourt. She's our Director of Exhibitions at the Juno Beach Center Association. Marie-Ève was actually helped to design the original From Vimy to Juno exhibit that existed over in France, and she'll tell you a little bit about that today. She's also working on very hard on our From Dieppe to Juno exhibits. We tend to keep the titles similar. That's going to be opening over in France in March. So that's really exciting. And then she's got another project that we're really excited. We won't talk about that too much today, but there's a lot of activity going. Jennifer Terry, she served as the project lead for the content development and curation of the From Vimy to Juno website project. And she's now the executive director of Defining Moments Canada. And she'll probably tell you a little bit about that in her talk here. We have Lindsay Hutchison here with us today. It's really great to have just recently met Lindsay and to put a face to the name behind all these great lesson plans. She's a social studies department leader and teacher of social studies 10, 20th century history and genocide studies in Surrey, BC. And she developed the lesson plans, as I said. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Warren Willonsky. He is the president and founder of Plank, a Montreal-based digital agency that specializes in developing websites primarily for cultural and arts organizations like ourselves. And he and his team take immense pride in developing projects that matter and aim to make the world a better place. And I think they've really done a great job here. So I'm going to roll into a few questions here for our panel, and I'll just get them to kind of unmute themselves. But we're going to start with Marie-Ève here. Marie-Ève, the From Vimy to Juno digital exhibition is based in part on the Juno Beach Center's original physical temporary exhibition by the same name. As Director of Exhibitions, could you tell us a little bit about the inspiration for the original exhibition?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Alex, and welcome everyone. So it's kind of funny now to look back on this show after all these years, but it started coming to birth, I guess, in 2015, and the main driver, I could say, was jealousy. We were knowing at the time that we would be seeing the 100th anniversary of the Vimy Ridge. We all knew at the Juno Beach Center, the entire crew was well aware that Vimy Memorial would get almost 1 million visitors each year with thousands of Canadian students. And one day we sat there with Jenna and went, how could we get them to go from Vimy to Juno? And that's how the title was born, is how can we drive traffic and take on that massive pilgrimage culture that lives around the Vimy Memorial and make that descend upon Juno and link the two together. So back then too, the new $20 bill had a Vimy memorial on it. We were hoping to get the Juno Beach Center on a $5 bill. So I guess the beginning of the project, it was a little bit of jealousy towards the Vimy Ridge Memorial. But the essential premise around the French show was basically that we did the math and looked at how many Canadian soldiers lay dead forever in the soil of France. And the math amounts to 52,000 Canadians who are buried in France as a result of our service in the 2 world wars. So that's a substantial legacy. And around that comes a culture of remembrance and pilgrimage of Canadians wanting to visit their loved ones overseas. And 52,000, I'll compare with a couple of things, is substantial because in Italy you have about 3,000, 4,000. In Belgium you have another couple of thousand. In the Netherlands you have about 4,000. So small numbers across the world, but there's nowhere else. There's no other country on earth that has more Canadian soldiers buried in this soil. So we did the math too with all proportionalities kept. Let's say one was to imagine that the 2 world wars were fought in Canada and French soldiers came over to our rescue. It would be the equivalent of today of having 250,000 Frenchmen buried in Canada. And that would create a culture of pilgrimage for French people to visit their loved ones in Canada. So that's a number that we pulled from doing proportionalities like the size of the population in the 2 world wars, the ratio of men who served overseas and were killed and buried there. So if we can only imagine today, if there were 250,000 Frenchmen buried in our country, we would be seeing a lot of French people traveling to visit loved ones. So that's sort of how it started. And of course, being anchored in Normandy in France, the show had to be, I guess, mainly addressed to French people. So basically, we unrolled the history of pilgrimage, how Canadians go to France and commemorate their loved ones. But then we added a spin to it. We started to do a deep dive research into how French people commemorated Canadian soldiers in their soil. And so we looked at, of course, the Vimy pilgrimage of 1936, but over the years, what held it together when Canadian people couldn't make it over on major anniversaries, it was the French people. So in a sense, we were trying to showcase to French people of today that French people of yesterday had played a major, massive role in perpetuating this legacy. And so it was like a sort of a mirror effect exhibition experience where we would show Canadians that the French people had always been there at our side, and at the same time show Canadians and French people that we have this massive culture of commemoration, and the numbers speak for themselves at the major anniversaries we've seen in recent years and also in the past. So it was a really a key, I guess, concern that we had to make the show relevant to French people. And the highlight of the show at the time, it was very exciting. We managed to get a piece of the old Vimy Memorial, because as we all know, the Vimy Monument was completely rehauled in 2008, 2009, over quite a few years. When you visited the memorial, it was all covered, but they kept 4 pieces from the original monument and gave one to us. So for the duration of the show, a massive piece that weighed about 400 kilos and traveled from Vimy to Juno to be, so we had a piece of Vimy inside the Juno Beach Center for a couple of years, and it was really exciting. And I'll leave it at that for now, but I do have a couple more things to say about the exhibition education program and some of the activities that we had in there. You're mute.
Here. Before we transition to talking about the Canadian version of the exhibition, maybe tell us a little bit about that, the educational resources that were available over in France for the mostly, I guess, a French audience, I would think.
Yes. So the education program was comprised of 5 family stories that spanned over the 2 world wars. 3 of them were Canadian and 2 of them were French. So we actually had the kids contrast and compare between the experiences of French and Canadian families. So we selected families, and it wasn't hard to find a lot of possible, families to showcase. It was really difficult to narrow it down to only 5, but they had the particularity. What made them all the same is that they had an ancestor that had fought in both the First and the Second World War. And so some of the program was supported by app learning. So we had a sort of the classrooms were divided into groups, and they would be assigned a family. And so a group of students became sort of the ambassadors for a family and presented it to the others. And through the apps, the questions would come. Some of them had common questions, but they were all varied. So it was really letting the student learn and teach other students about the contents by contrast and comparing. Of course, the experiences of a French family versus a Canadian one were vastly different, but we also made the kids focus on some of the similarities. And one of the activity that was quite popular with the students and the teachers were where we asked the 2 groups the classrooms would be divided into 2 groups. One was assigned the memorial, team, and the other was assigned the veterans benefits team. And both teams had to argue over the question of, if you're a government after a war, do you spend money in raising money to build a memorial, or do you save your money, not build a memorial, and focus on giving veterans pensions? Because some of the families' issues was reintegrating civilian life after the war. So that was always a great activity to lead with the students. They could really argue and contemplate the complexities of what it's like to try to both remember and leave a legacy to visit, but at the same time foster a new generation to be able to contribute to Canadian society. So, and I guess the main difference we had in the family stories is that in France, service was compulsory, whereas in Canada, it was all volunteer. So that's just a few tidbits, but I'll leave it at that.
Oh, thank you so much, Mary-Eve. It's great to kind of be able to relive that exhibit a little bit today through you. And now I'm going to move into, this From Vimy to Juno, this Canadian-focused Vimy to Juno, and move to Jen. Jen, can you speak to the process to readapting and shaping the exhibition material to fit From Vimy to Juno, Canadians Through 2 World Wars?
Yes, absolutely. So from the title, you can see that this virtual site was meant to focus more on the Canadian story than the French story that Mary-Eve spoke about, but certainly that was still an important element in it. And one of the biggest advantages of the virtual exhibit versus a physical exhibit is that we had increased space to cover material and wider available audience. So we wanted to use that to our advantage and incorporate a wider range of individual stories in greater detail. And we knew from the success of the education program at the Juno Beach Center and the use of personal stories and nuanced perspectives, as Mary-Eve's just laid out, that those sorts of stories and those entry points really help students and any individual really to relate to a history that often seems very, very distant. So by focusing on these elements within the context of the larger narrative, we could showcase the connection that not only Canada and Canadians as a unit have to these 2 major global events, but we could also add the nuance to the historical space by highlighting distinct and unique stories. So we aim to tell the story of Canada's involvement in 2 world wars and the intervening period in a way that appealed to and represented at least some of Canada's diversity, and also helped to fulfill the needs of educators who needed to have access to a vast array of curated primary materials. And that inclusion of all those primary materials helped us to tell more detailed and different perspectives. So a small example is you can't tell the story of Canada in the Second World War without mentioning the Italian campaign, but an oft-omitted, very interesting and significant aspect of that is the idea of the D-Day Dodger. So by including a primary source in the Italian campaign section, of the D-Day Dodger recording. We were also able to present the lyrics and a quote from an Italian campaign veteran. And it represents that sort of small aspect of the story that's also a very important perspective.
I also really love the poetry, I believe, that's in the
Yes.
Italian campaign section as well. There's a really moving poem by a Canadian, another major actually, who was killed at Ortona, and I definitely encourage everybody to check that out if they get a moment. Now, turning a little bit to the more technical nature of things. Warren, Planck was very involved in the production of From Vimy to Juno, and I was wondering if you could tell us about the role that digital media resources can play in educational spaces and how students can benefit from using this website as opposed to perhaps a traditional textbook.
Yeah, so I mean, listening to Marie-Ève and Jen discuss, the content and the process they went through and all the different things that they did and all these powerful stories, we're really proud of having the opportunity to actually work with this content and work with the team and basically create a platform that allows users of the site now that they have access to it, to basically be able to explore and look at the content in different ways. A textbook is a powerful thing. There's nothing more powerful than the written word, which allows you to kind of imagine and think about different things in different ways by reading through a story. But everybody learns in different ways and everybody explores things in different ways. So the idea that somebody could read, the 80,000 to 92,000 French words on the site, but at the same time explore different materials and come as close as you can, other than if you had the material physically in front of you, which most people will never get the opportunity to do, to look at a high definition object online and connect with it and look at photos and really, kind of enhance that emotional understanding and the emotional empathy that somebody's going to have for these stories of people that sacrificed their lives and, all the different things that Canada as a country went through to get through that war. And to be able to offer that up in an online platform, that just makes me really proud that we were able to work on that with everybody.
Oh, thanks for that answer. It's a great answer, Warren. And you guys definitely should be proud of what you've done, just as our team should be proud of the contents as well. Lindsay, turning things to you. Speaking of the benefits of a digital format, the website includes, as I said, over 300 digitized materials. In the way Warren explained, allowing students and the general public to immerse themselves in the topic. Could you speak to the role of historical thinking concepts in this layout? And maybe you can provide maybe a little background of what historical thinking concepts are. We have a little diagram to help you out.
Sure. When I wrote the lesson plans, my home province of BC was in the midst of a transition to a new curriculum that was centered on these historical thinking skills. And I'd been working on them with my own students for quite some time already. And after working with them over those years, I experienced their power firsthand. I saw that students seemed much more curious about what they were learning, and their learning seemed deeper. And I think the wealth of digitized evidence in this exhibit means that it's really unlikely that a student will be able to look at everything, but by combining the curatorial thinking that Jen's going to talk about with these historical thinking skills, the students are still able to intentionally explore in depth and make meaning from the sources. At the center of this is really the analysis of evidence and then making those connections to the other 5 skills that you can see on your screen.
Yeah, so very important just for, building good Canadian citizens, building people who are engaged with their society and can think critically about what's going on in that society. I love it. Jen, Defining Moments Canada uses a curatorial thinking model. Could you speak to the role of curatorial thinking concepts in this digital resource?
Yes, absolutely. I'd actually argue that a lot of people use a curatorial thinking model. We've just kind of put a name on it and are trying to apply a framework to it. And as you've just said, it helps to teach students how to interpret the world around them, and that's what curatorial thinking is all about. So it refers to a strategy specifically that actively engages students in their learning through what we're calling the SAS framework, and you can see that in front of you. Selection, archiving, sense-making, and sharing. And curating is a process many of us go through every day. A really simple example is how you present yourself on social media. You put some thought into what photos you put out there, what story they're trying to tell, and how you're sharing them. So through this SAS process, students are introduced to the roles and skills of a curator, hence the name, as a way to demonstrate their learning. The entire nature of this website, the presentation of many primary documents which present many perspectives and situations, encourage a curatorial mindset. What pieces will the students retain to help them tell the story? And the lesson resources are all set up to encourage the process of selecting and archiving in order to make sense of a story that will ultimately be shared. Students at the very first lesson are asked to curate their own identity. What pieces would they select to be key features, and how do those pieces work together to make sense of the big picture that they have of themselves? How do they ultimately present themselves to the world? And that's all in the interest of considering how their identity will guide and influence their curatorial process, specifically selecting and sense making through the later exercises. So in those later resources, they must consider what's essential in telling a grand Canadian story, and telling individual stories, to create pilgrimages and to create a memorial. And these lessons are all obviously sort of originally meant to be used, but via the collection of the primary documents on the website, if the focus is supposed to be on the First and Second World War in terms of your content and your curriculum, but they're all very adaptable to other sorts of topics. And lesson 3 specifically gives the students the chance to explore individual journeys through their own history and their own family stories. So I think that's really excellent.
Oh, certainly. Warren, back to you. As Jennifer and Lindsay just discussed, each topic on the website has its associated digital materials. From a design perspective, how does the From Vimy to Juno website maximize the viewing experience for people wanting to explore these items?
So I'll do my best to explain this, but obviously my team, who are the ones that actually worked on this on a day-to-day basis and were the ones designing it, can probably answer this question better than I can, but I'll do my best. So there's a few design principles that we apply to all the work that we do. The first one is it's what we call a mobile first design approach. In other words, we made sure that even though a lot of the materials are expansive and maybe we might assume that a desktop is the best place to kind of explore in a large format all of the visual materials or to sit and read, the reality of how people use the internet now is that mobile is going to be their primary device that they're going to be using. So we made sure that from a design perspective, the site worked just as well in either format as well as tablets, so that no matter how somebody was navigating the site, that they could have a great experience. The other thing is, as you demonstrated, Alex, at the beginning, is there are multiple different ways to explore the site. And it gives people with different ways that they like to explore the opportunity to get to as much of the site as they can. If somebody's more linear, they could then just keep reading through and then click at the bottom and go to the next story, the next story, and the next story. They can basically, navigate through what is called in the internet world a hamburger menu, which is the little menu up at the top, which is a very traditional way of navigating on mobile. So you can expose as much of the site as quickly as possible. Or somebody can click back to the homepage. The logo, the logo of the website up in the top left corner is pretty much a standard spot where which everybody knows, oh, that's how I get back to the homepage in case I'm lost or I don't know where I am. But the key vehicle we wanted to do is we wanted to ensure that the site encouraged exploration and encouraged people to explore all the different objects and click around and come out of it at the end afterwards, basically feeling like they managed to almost create their own journey by going through and learning as much as they could.
Alex seems to be frozen on us. We'll give him a moment. Alex, I think you're back.
I'm back just now. Hopefully I didn't miss too much there. The one thing I was picking up there from Warren's commentary is I'm definitely a linear thinker because for the longest time, I did not use the hamburger at all to navigate the website. I completely missed that it was even there. And I was using this site like on a weekly basis, like editing it, fixing it up, making adjustments. And for whatever reason, I just kept using the timeline where I kept going back to the main page. I was just like, oh, I can't believe I haven't been using this for a while. So I find it's a little easier to use the hamburger one to get specifically to where you want to go quickly. But, my mind was set up for the linear method of like, okay, what comes next and using the timeline. So anyway, over to you, Jen, now. One of the most striking things about From Vimy to Juno is the way it weaves personal narratives throughout. why feature personal stories, and can you provide us with an example that illustrates this?
I'm very happy to do that. So in my mind, and this is certainly a personal, I think, though perhaps a widely accepted idea that I imposed on the site, but the most important reason to weave these personal stories throughout this grand Canadian narrative is to provide nuance, dimension, and diversity to what can often seem a universal and monotone history as it's told on textbooks or in war movies. It's very often the story of white males, infantrymen, Canadians who drove in tanks and that sort of thing. So adding in these personal stories, which offer a huge array of different perspectives, provides a lot of different entry points for people who might have found it harder to relate to them in the first place. So even if a story seems straightforward on the surface and it seems clear where it fits into that conventional and common narrative, when you dig into those individual, especially with the benefit of the primary documents, there's often much more to be found. Just really briefly about Archie, since we already talked about it a little, it's probably the story on the site that seems the most standard. He's a white male infantryman. It's exceptional in that he served in 2 world wars, and we have a wealth of material. But something it exposes that I think often gets lost is the experience of the Canadians who were left at home and the yearning of Canadians who were on the front lines for the normalcy of home. So Archie talks about his sheep in his letters. You can get a glimpse of what his wife is writing to him and a glimpse of what his wife experienced after he died and the hard choices that she had to make to make sure she could maintain the lives of her children. I want to talk in more detail, though, about the story of Masumi Mitsui. The story of Japanese internment during the Second World War is well known, and the general racism of the Canadian forces in the First World War is at least mostly accepted as a narrative. And those are very key elements to his story. Mitsui had to work very hard to be able to enlist in the Canadian forces in the First World War, finally finding himself lumped into an all-Japanese battalion. And he would ultimately lead that battalion and be awarded the military medal, returning home to Canada and his family, a decorated war veteran. Just over 20 years later, he was called to turn himself into an RCMP office. As a Japanese man, he was deemed an enemy alien. He stormed into the office, slammed his war medals on the table, and said to the officer, "Do these mean nothing anymore?" No thought was given to the ways he had previously demonstrated his loyalty to his chosen home of Canada by putting his life on the line in Europe and watching his friends and comrades die. His home and properties were still taken from him, and he was still treated like a criminal simply because of his country of birth. So it was decades before Mitsui and other Japanese Canadians would receive an apology, and Mitsui's family recounts how every year on Remembrance Day, he would dress in his uniform and his medals and sit in silent remembrance alone in his home, isolated from others who may have shared his experience. In the 1980s, his service was finally recognized publicly. He was an honored guest at a ceremony in Hamilton, and later at the rededication of the Japanese-Canadian War Memorial in Stanley Park in Vancouver. So you may think to yourself, I already know what happened to Japanese Canadians during the Second World War, but I think this story in particular exemplifies that what you know isn't always the whole story, and that's the value that these personal narratives can bring. And the final thing I'll mention quickly here is while we have these several personal narratives on the site that we explore in great detail, within each of the events, there are smaller tidbits of personal narratives, interviews with veterans, some video recordings, quotes, letters, photographs, and all those small tidbits continue to add that nuance and dimension to these better well-known stories. And to give you those individual impacts and varied experiences. And I don't think you can tell the whole story without considering those.
Well, thank you, Jen. That is beautifully told. Very important story for us to keep in mind and remember. Lindsay, this idea of personal narrative is a thread throughout the educational packages that you develop for From Vimy to Juno. In fact, the question that informs the 5 lessons plans is to what extent is identity, personal and national, shaped by conflict? Can you talk about the decision to center identity as key in the educational materials for this resource?
Sure. Well, we know that powerful learning centers voice and choice. And in order to do that, I think students need to first understand who they are and how their identity shapes their perspectives and actions. And from there, it's an easy extension to do the same for historical figures or even a country. Unfortunately, for some of our students, they don't connect very much with history. And I think one of the biggest reasons for this is what they've been exposed to is such a narrow view of history. It doesn't always include people or topics that they personally connect to. And so it doesn't feel very authentic for them. But I think that this exhibit does such a great job of broadening that narrative for our students. And it's through analyzing various identities that they can make those personal connections to the past, or even a person from the past. And it's in those connections that make the students invested in their learning, and history will come alive for them.
Awesome. These lesson plans can be used in succession. I think they're kind of originally set up with that in mind, if people want to. And that helps students build towards an understanding of how identity, as you've stated, both their own and national, is shaped. What was the reasoning behind developing the lesson plans in this successional way?
Yeah, again, it comes back to that facilitating deep learning and connection for the students. For me, this exhibit is really about journeys, the journey of our students, that of the individuals highlighted in the exhibit, and also that of an entire nation. In order to fully acknowledge these journeys, we need to recognize that there are so many facets to them, allowing the students to start from a common narrative and then branch out into an individual's experience of their choice. We're allowing them to connect facets of their own personal identity with the identity facets of a historical figure. Seeing elements of themselves in history is incredibly powerful, and I don't really think it's possible to do that justice with just an individual lesson.
Love that. That's a great answer. Jen, From Vimy to Juno, as you've noted, doesn't just cover historic military events, battles, what have you. It also looks at the often discarded or disregarded aspects of the impact of war on Canada. The website explores the women's fight for the right to vote in the interwar period, Indigenous involvement in the world wars, I really liked the fact that we had conscientious objectors in there, because that's just a subject that just doesn't get a lot of, we talk about those who serve, we often don't remember to talk about those who didn't serve and perhaps why they didn't serve. At least in the traditional way. They may have found other ways to contribute. The role of Acadian military personnel is quite special for the Juno Beach Center, because every year we have kind of Acadian Week at the museum and make that a real focus. But why was this level of diversity important when developing the website's content? And I think you've already kind of explained this a little bit, but maybe dig a little deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the answer is sort of twofold, one for the narratives and one for the events. In terms of the events, I thought it was very important to cover the key historic milestones outside of the military history between 1914 and 1945, because they are all part of not only that grand Canadian narrative, but also all of the individual stories in different ways. The non-military events, which happened during and between the wars, impacted how Canadians experienced and perceived the military events, and vice versa, the events of the wars impacted what was happening off of the battlefield. And to leave them out would have been to tell an incomplete story of those decades. In terms of the diversity of the personal narratives, I think the idea was to try and diversify the definition of the word service. So we talk about service, and very often it's like, okay, so they enlisted and they went and they served on the battlefields, and maybe they came home and maybe they didn't. But through the conscientious objector story, through the stories of some of the Indigenous veterans and some of the other men who served in both wars and during the Second War stayed on the home front, and through the stories of the Acadian veterans, you can see that service meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I'd argue that they all served in some way, but certainly that experience wasn't universal.
Excellent, thank you. Warren, on this note of diversity of stories, we hope that students will see themselves reflected in Canada's military history somehow. That's one of our major themes of today's discussion. How can we make sure that students see themselves somewhat reflected in this? How does a digital format for an educational resource like From Vimy to Juno help to make history more accessible to a diverse audience?
So, we take this topic really, really seriously. And, we've really been talking about it in recent years as something that we call ethical website design. In other words, what we want to be doing is developing websites that take into account the key tenets of what a modern website should do, and what a website should do that represents all members of the Canadian public and people around the world, which is we want to build websites that load quickly, so that anybody from anywhere, depending if they're in a high-speed connection to a rural connection, have a good experience with this website. That we take privacy seriously, that we make sure that best practices are followed, so that the websites load in ways that are expected and are universal to all users. And most importantly, we want to make sure that the website is accessible, so that everybody with every different ability or technical usage of the site, everybody's situation, everybody from across Canada has some kind of different way that they're going to use the site. And by taking into account all the technical ways that we needed to represent the content of the site, we take that responsibility seriously to make sure that as many people can have as high quality an experience with the website as possible.
Thanks, Warren. It's a really important part of this. And I know a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into making sure that those resources would be available in an accessible way. So this is going to be my last question. Then we'll move into questions from the audience. So audience, if you have any questions, get them in while we do this last question, and hopefully our panel will be able to address them. This last question is for Lindsay. Lindsay, as an educator, how do you hope students will engage with the content of the digital exhibition to inform their thinking?
Well, as has been previously mentioned, there's such a wealth of material on the website, with over 300 digitized materials. There's really something for every student. I hope that they'll explore, question, and share with each other. We all know that the stories are incredibly powerful, and in their sharing, we often want to know more. And I hope that the students find themselves returning to the exhibit repeatedly as they learn more from their classmates.
Awesome. All right. Well, that ends our formal question and answer period. Now we'll move into the Q&A period from the audience. And this can be as long or as short as the audience wishes. We're happy to we've got at least another maybe 10 more minutes before we'll think about shutting things down a bit. But if you have any questions for any of us, it might be a question about, the original exhibit over in France, which Marie-Ève could answer, anything about website design, for history or other learning purposes, anything about the lesson plans, anything about the content on the website, please let us know. Louisa, do you have a first question for us at all yet?
Yes, so we have one here from Samantha Cohen. Says, this website is so beautiful and the knowledge and material and resource in here is so huge. We can now access from the palm of our hand all of what the center has in France and more. So thank you, Samantha. And she says, what's next for you guys for online tools / resources?
Oh man, I'm assuming she means the Juno Beach Center and Juno Beach Center Association. No firm plans as of right now, but we do have opportunities coming up. And those opportunities perhaps revolve around our From Dieppe to Juno exhibit that's going in March, in addition to a major renovation that will be made to Room G. Room G at the Juno Beach Center is our Faces of Canada Today exhibition, which is about Canada in the post-war era and the Canada that our veterans, helped build after the Second World War. Marie-Ève could probably speak to this a little more. We don't have any strict plans on what we're going to do in terms of digital resources around those, but there is a fairly significant digital component for Room G, and so some of that may be parlayed into a digital, website or something like that.
We're developing virtual visits for the center itself, and we're developing a bunker tour as well. For digital access, but that's in the works right now. Yeah,
that's a good catch, Marie-Ève. I almost forgot that, but that's a really exciting piece that hopefully will come, sometime maybe in 2022. I think is the intent, but we will see. And it's a project that the museum itself is spearheading. What kind of platform, Sam? It'll probably be in the form of some sort of like webinar style, or at least an online video that you can access. We're not sure yet what the format's going to be 100%, but it certainly will be, a way for you to access the platform online and, potentially get a tour. I'm not quite sure if it's going to be,
Oh, Alex is having trouble again. The bunker tours will be, she says, awesome, which bunker? So that will be the tunnels and the HQ underground and the main bunker that's right in front of the Juno Beach Center.
And I'll just hop in. We had a question for Brian asking when you can view the website. The website is live now. I've put the link in the chat and also answered his question there. So please feel free to check it out and tell us what you think. So we've lost Alex temporarily. He'll be back in a moment. But do we have any other questions while we're waiting?
I am back.
Very good. Here from Mark, we have, in terms of what the next, I'm wondering whether the Battle of the Scheldt should get more attention on account of the popularity of the Forgotten Battle movie out now on Netflix. Canadians feature largely in it, as they should.
That's a good question. You know, unfortunately, the Battle of the Scheldt is not included on From Vimy to Juno. It's just not a topic that kind of made the final list. Of course, we're trying to cover, you know, an entire half century of Canadian conflict and interactions in and around that. It's interesting, the Forgotten Battle, I've seen the movie. Unfortunately, I don't think it does much to help to alleviate that notion of it being a forgotten battle. But certainly more needs to be said about the Battle of the Scheldt. We do have a really great, if you look at our online exhibitions, if you were to go to junobeach.org and you go to our museum tab, under online exhibitions, we do have an exhibition that was remade as an online version called Maple Leaves and Tulips. And that particular exhibition, which is a flip book, PDF flip book, it does cover the Battle of the Scheldt in part. And so that's where I would direct people on our website to go see more information about that. What do we have next for questions here?
I can actually just quickly point out something in the Q&A, which is Annika Bell, the project manager on Plank side from the project, just mentioned as well that there's a French URL that you can go directly to. And then, yeah, I see that was just put directly in chat. So if somebody wants to have an immediate French experience or an immediate English experience, there's 2 separate URLs for that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And did everybody get that link? I did see that was one of the questions, but make sure you go check that out. Obviously, we're gonna, the site is live now, and it's going to be, you know, we haven't, you know, made it active on our website. The link's active yet, but we're going to be doing that over the next couple of days. So it should be very easy to find the exhibition from our main website as well very shortly.
Alex, would you mind if I just wanted to say something actually, if you don't mind, which is, I just wanted to say that I appreciate everything that the Juno Beach Center does and stands for, and your work and Jen's hard work and everybody else's hard work on this project over the years that this has happened. It means a lot to me personally to be involved with you on this project, and that we were able to collaborate with you to do something as important as this project. And I just wanted to share that because I know that there's been a lot of work that's gone in on everybody's part to make this come true, and I'm just proud that we're actually here, actually celebrating it after all this time.
Me too. It's too bad we couldn't do it in person. Maybe crack some champagne or maybe some Calvados or something like that. But yeah, it's a real. I was kind of a small part of this in a sense. I mean, I kind of got it over the finish line at the end. I was kind of just like crossing I's and dotting T's. But it's just so incredible to get this work finally out there to our audience. So thank you for your team for helping us get it there.
Couple last questions here. We have one from Samantha. Will this presentation be available to download or watch later?
Of course, yes. It'll be, we've been recording it, and unfortunately I've been dropping in and out, so that's fun. But yes, it will be available for watching later. We'll make sure to get it out on our newsletter and on our social media channels as well.
I'll just say, I noticed there are 2 participants with raised hands. In the webinar function, it's easier if you write the questions in the Q&A period area if you're able to, and we'll address them that way. And then we have a question from Brian. Have you communicated with book writers Ted Barris or David O'Keefe?
Yes, on both counts. actually, if you anybody is aware, the Juno Beach Center Association hosts a monthly podcast called Juno Beach and Beyond. You can find that on our main website. And David O'Keefe has been a guest twice on that podcast, once about his book on the Battle of Normandy, and another on his book about the Dieppe raid, and Ted Barris's most recent book on medics and rushing to danger, I think was the title, or something like that. He was interviewed there. So yes, we're in communication with them. In doing the From Dieppe to Juno exhibit, we did consult with David on a few things. He gave us some advice and some leads to follow up. We also did a really cool series called the Dieppe Messages back in August for the 79th anniversary of the Dieppe raid. And actually, it was David's idea for us to do that. And he provided us with a lot of the documents that allowed us to create that really cool series of messages, which were displayed as tweets on Twitter. So absolutely, we've got some connections there.
Great. And then another couple we have from Dr. Robert Small. Are historiographical issues addressed throughout the site?
I think that's a better question perhaps for Jen, or perhaps Jen, you could tackle that one.
I'm afraid I don't think the answer is yes. They aren't tackled certainly in any sort of comprehensive or purposeful way. The narrative on the website, most of the text on the website tries to tell the story that's communicated through the primary documents and generally sticks to the well-accepted stories. We consulted, as Alex mentioned, the lead historian on the project was Dr. Serge Derflinger, who is a very well-respected Canadian historian himself. And certainly the Juno Beach Center has benefited from the contributions and consultation of many fantastic historians, and any historiography probably comes from there, but we certainly don't go into any of the greater debates about different details of the Second World War or First World War.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate that.
Another question here. What do you see as the lasting impact of the COVID pandemic on the role and function of the center? Has adapting to the new normal changed the way you approach commemoration?
Oh, thanks for the tough question there, David. I really appreciate it. Mary-Eve, did you want to tackle that while I try to think of a better answer?
Yes, okay, I can do that. There's been a huge impact, primarily that it makes the ceremonies much smaller. That's what we've experienced so far. And the fact that we're used to, the larger the crowd, the better the ceremony. The ways in which the audience can typically engage with us is up in the air until we can resume to the new normal. So, but what we've noticed is that there's definitely an increase in people wanting to see parts of the ceremony live, and we try to showcase that as much as we can by putting videos, and the interaction on our social media has increased since the pandemic COVID, and Alex can attest to that probably even more better than I am. But the new normal has yet to be defined, David, and we're sure going to be on the track of always being the best and the most innovative and creative. I think that's what we're known for with our ceremonies, being formal yet informal, solid yet warm, and I think those traditions that have defined the Juno Beach Center experience will continue to live on, whichever way we have to find a way. Alex?
Oh, that's a great answer, Mary-Eve. And yeah, I think, ultimately, the museum is a for-profit entity, right, overseas. Like it's meant to operate as a business and to generate income, through ticket sales, through gift shop sales. And that's been a bit of a difficulty during the pandemic. Now, we've been ably supported by Veterans Affairs Canada to kind of try to alleviate that. But there's still, as you said, Mary-Eve, we don't know what the new normal is going to look like. Is the new normal, we were up to over 100,000 visitors a year before the pandemic. And what does the new normal look like going forward? Is it going to be back up there by 2024, or is it not going to be there? Increasingly, the need for resources like this to allow people to access the museum online is increasingly important. As we Canadians, at the moment, it's more and more difficult for Canadians to actually go overseas, or it's more cost prohibitive because they have to get a COVID test or what have you. And so those are things we have to kind of factor in to where we're putting our resources and how we're engaging with the public for sure as well. But it's been really amazing the couple of times, especially this year, that we've actually had Canadians visit the museum, and we've had some very moving ceremonies at the museum, especially with members of the Canadian Armed Forces who have been coming through. Those are the moments that the staff always reach out and say, this was kind of the highlight of our year, right? And it's always, having those moments on the beach with other Canadians, with French people as well, with everybody who comes to try to remember at our museum.
Alex, one of the things I'm proudest of working on digital projects like this is that I feel like your website or this project give millions of people that might not have had the opportunity to actually connect with the museum, and it actually then creates the next round of people that are going to visit. I mean, I know that there's a lot of educational programs that encourage people to come, but digital is not out to replace the museum experience. Digital is to get more people into the museum. Absolutely. And if we can connect with people that first time and get them excited about history and about the war, not excited about a war, but excited about learning about the war. That's how we're going to connect people and get them back into the museum eventually.
Absolutely, Warren. Well said.
I recognize we're over time. We've got one last question here from Jeff, inquiring about volunteer program in Canada.
Hi, Jeff. Hope you're doing well. I know it's been a while since we've chatted. Jeff actually helped out on our Legacy of Honor video project. I think it was a year or more ago now. He was doing some transcription for us. Unfortunately, that program had to be slowed down and effectively, paused for the moment because of the COVID pandemic. We couldn't do any more interviews with veterans. We've actually just recently been able to do one. We had some special circumstances that allowed for that to happen in a safe environment. And so, Jeff, if you're interested in doing another transcription when I actually have the 10 to 13 minute video available, I'll certainly reach out to you. Our volunteer program in Canada, we have a volunteer board, and that's kind of the core of our volunteers, if you will. But I will be honest, I think we can do a better job at the Juno Beach Center Association of having a volunteer program and managing that and focusing people towards the efforts that are going to benefit the museum. We've certainly had plenty of people who have done fundraisers for the museum in recent years, who've done a great job. And we can, probably do a better job of leveraging, interested people, not just to do fundraisers, but also to help with various projects that the museum is doing. Some of these digital projects, right? Some of the tasks that you have to do, for building a website like this are quite tedious, right? You've got to do those transcripts for all the audio files. You've got to, make sure that it's a lot of transcripts. That's the captions and various pieces are all together, proofreading, things like that. We could do a better job of making use of our volunteers for that. And I think we've been doing a little bit of a better job recently in terms of getting some people on board to help us, but maybe a more formal volunteer program is something we should consider.
Are there any remaining questions before we close out?
So if not, thank you so very much for coming, everyone. Thank you to everybody who participated and attended the webinar. We encourage you to explore museumvimy2juno.ca and send us your feedback. Of course, there's the feedback form on the website that you can use to do that. This webinar was recorded, and the recording should be available in the next few days. I just want to say from the entire team here and from all the panelists, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year to all of you. And look forward to your use of the resources and your feedback about your use of them in the classroom.